From magazines to television shows and movies, fair features have been portrayed as the ideal standard, causing millions of Americans to spend nearly $3 billion a year in bleaching creams, tablets, and injectables, all designed to make their skin lighter. The shocking statistics and impact of colorism on the economy and the mental and physical health of Black and Brown people, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Colorism is a form of discrimination favoring people with lighter skin over those with darker skin. It's reflected in harmful beauty standards, who and what is considered beautiful, in biased hiring practices, and across the media. And it's not just a problem in majority white communities. The issue is also prevalent in communities of color. It is well documented that darker skin is associated with everything from longer prison sentences for the same crime, decreased mental health, lower marital rates for women, lower wages for men and immigrants, and lower perceived intelligence. Studies also show darker skinned Black children are more likely to experience frequent suspensions from school, and both white and Black children are biased towards lighter skinned kids. And a growing body of research shows that both in-group and out-group discrimination on the basis of skin color is associated with worse physical health outcomes for African Americans. And shockingly, that in-group, this study shows that in-group colorism is more dangerous than a lifetime of discrimination, everyday discrimination, and perceived out-group colorism. The researcher who made this shocking finding is here for our lead-off discussion. Joining me is Dr. Ellis Monk. He's a sociology professor at Harvard University and an expert on race, inequality, and colorism. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Monk.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Wow. Okay, so I read this recent article you wrote in the American Sociological Association Journal of Health and Social Behavior, and it has some shocking findings about colorism. Obviously, I want to spend some time this morning with you, having you help us unpack the findings in your journal report. But first, I want to ask you, just generally, give us the history of why melanin is seen as bad and lighter skin is seen as good.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think really when we think about modern day contemporary colorism and even what's gone on in this country over the past few centuries, we have to think about colonialism, and we need to think about the transatlantic slave trade and how darker skin was associated with lower status, being a slave, not having power in society. And one thing we know about human beings is that they tend to emulate people who are at the top of social hierarchies. And this is one way, devalorizing the phenotype of people who you enslave. This is one way of dehumanizing them and trying to justify their enslavement, trying to justify their subjugation. And of course, when you set up a social hierarchy in that way, people tend to go along with it. So those are really the roots of thinking about the link between melanin and discrimination.
So, but even in Asian and European cultures, we've seen, Dr. Monk, that the same hierarchical structure where darker skinned Asian people were less favored than lighter skinned, and people actually stayed in their homes trying to avoid the sun, trying to avoid, the darkening of their skin, dating back centuries. So, you gave us that great history in terms of what happened, with respect to slavery in America, but even other cultures, this obsession with skin color.
Sure, yes. And this is something I actually talk about and teach here at Harvard in my global comparative class on race. And again, it's about social hierarchies and social status. And social status is really at the heart of discrimination. So these forms of discrimination against darker skin outside of the European African dynamic are really about the social status of having jobs that will allow you to work inside as opposed to outside, and the kind of stigma that we're that was associated with being an agricultural worker in a lot of these different societies, far before we even had the transatlantic slave trade. So again, it's really about what the social meaning and the economic meaning of melanin has meant for a lot of these different societies, even outside of slavery, even outside of the black-white dynamic.
So I know this is a subject near and dear to you. You teach it at Harvard University. You've written extensively about it. But when did sociologists like yourself really start tracking, this concept of colorism? Because it's something I think many of us have heard a lot about. Some folks not quite sure what it actually means, how it plays
Sure.
out. But it seems like, as I was doing my research for today's show, I saw just a myriad of articles popping up as if there was this resurgence of interest in the subject matter. Am I right about that? Is there this resurgence that's happening?
Absolutely. I think there has been a resurgence. I've been really fortunate to, be part of that resurgence with my own research. I know when I started researching this as a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, it really was not seen to be a viable or hot topic by many people, but I thought it was something that was really important. And again, the data don't really lie. When we care about racial inequality in this country and we have that conversation absent a discussion about skin tone, then we're not having a robust conversation about race in this country. So yes, I think you're right. There has been a resurgence, and I've been glad to see that resurgence.
Well, thank you for starting the research and being a visionary, even before, like you said, it was a hot topic, knowing that it was a critical part of this discussion about race and racism. Help us understand some of these technical terms. As I was reading your journal article, there were some terms that came up that I don't think we often hear, in kind of our pop culture world. And two of the terms that caught my attention were this notion of in-group versus out-group discrimination. Describe for us what the differences are.
Sure. So typically when we talk about racism in the United States, we're thinking about something that like white people would do to black people or to brown people. That's an out group. You're not talking about black people discriminating amongst themselves or brown people discriminating amongst themselves. But one thing that I highlight in my research is that in-group discrimination that also takes place among friends, among family members that are picking and choosing and treating people differently based on their skin tone and their facial features and their hair and their eye color. This form of discrimination is also really important, not just in terms of like socioeconomic outcomes, but mental and physical health, because this is a form of social stress that really keeps people on their toes, and it catches them with their guard down. A lot of the time you are kind of socialized, you're prepared for out-group incidents of discrimination, but there's a lot less socialization a lot of the time for black and brown people to deal with discrimination that they may feel like they've suffered from their sister or from their father or their mother. That's something that's much more tough to deal with, and that's the in-group discrimination.
We went through this period, Dr. Monk, where, we were all embracing the notion that black is beautiful. We've gone through this period where black women, we've embraced natural hairstyles, braids, twists, dreadlocks, weaves, wigs, color, whatever. It's like, just leave black women alone. Let us do whatever it is we, want to do to our hair, our makeup, our look. So why in this period of leave us alone, let us be, we are beautiful the way we are we seeing, are still having this conversation about colorism? Because I'm kind of thinking, that was yesterday's conversation, the light skinned, long hair, black girl, yeah, we went through that. But are we still, despite all of our, leave us alone, we're beautiful the way we are we still just as hung up on colorism today as we may have been 40, 50 years ago?
I think so. I think all the evidence points in that direction. And in one of my earlier papers, I actually point out that even during this period of Black is Beautiful and all of that, there's research to show that there are like Black beauty pageants that were still being won by like the lightest and brightest and all of that. So the rhetoric on the one hand, about Black is beautiful is one thing, but what's actually going on in everyday life on the ground and what's going on in the broader society, those two things don't necessarily line up. So I think looking back on that moment, I think it was a hope that was sustained. And I don't think that it reached the level that it needed to kind of unearth the structural nature of colorism, not
Has there been
just
any
among Black people, but in the broader society.
Right. So has there been any changes? Because when I looked at some of the research studies, still showing that darker skinned people more likely to get greater prison sentences for the same crime. Darker skinned people, particularly women, having more difficulties, marrying. Lighter skinned black people in particular having higher socioeconomic class than darker skinned people. So, over the period that you've done your research, has there been any improvement in the way we as a society, both black and white, think about dark skin versus light skin?
So I think there's been increasing public attention to the matter. But when we look at the cold hard facts, I don't think things have changed. If anything, I would argue some indicators we're getting worse. And I think, one other study I did recently, I led the study. We looked at not just skin tone and colorism, but we looked at its intersection with lookism, which is discrimination on the basis of physical appearance and beauty. And I led this study, quantitative, nationally representative data. And one of the main findings there was that Black women in particular, who were rated at the lower end of this attractiveness scale, well, usually that was predicted by darker skin tones. And their earnings, even after I took all these different factors like their education and their occupation into account, they were earning something like 63 cents on a dollar compared to Black women who were rated at the highest levels of attractiveness. And those women at the highest levels of this kind of perceptions of attractiveness, they actually earn more money than everyone in the sample, even white women at the highest levels of attractiveness. And that study, I like to highlight that study because it shows how complex and intersectional
Wait
this
a
whole
minute, Dr.
dynamic
Monk.
is.
Is this study an outlier? You're saying, quote unquote, attractive black women in your study, did they earn more than white men?
They earn more than white women at the highest levels of attractiveness, yes.
Okay, so not
About
white
the
men,
same or even more, yes.
not white
They
men.
were the outliers.
Well, hold on. But they didn't earn more than white men. They earned more than white women.
No, no one earned more than white men. Absolutely not. No,
So I'm about to
no.
fall out my chair. Okay.
I
Okay.
know.
Okay, but let's go back because you just said a whole lot there. I wasn't familiar with that study that you've done. And you said this is lookism.
Yeah, lookism. So one of the things about skin tone and colorism is that when we think about casting in Hollywood, when we think about the media and the stereotypes, you did a really good job with the introduction. Some of the stereotypes around skin tone and darkness are like, oh, they're ugly, they're not as attractive, and light skin is pretty and beautiful. Like the Toni Morrison bluest eye, that whole dynamic, right? Well, there's lots of research that looks at lookism on the labor market and finds that people who are not rated as attractive are earning less money than people who are rated as highly attractive. So in this study that I led, it was actually one of the very first studies that looked at race, gender, colorism, and lookism all together on the labor market. And what we found were that Black people were rated as less attractive from this kind of group of white interviewers who were mostly doing these ratings, these subjective ratings, of course. But when we look at even after we take education into account and family background and all these sorts of things, there is immense inequality on the labor market at the intersections of colorism and lookism. And it's about these racialized stereotypes around melanin and skin tone as being less valuable, less pretty, all these sorts of things.
Were you shocked to find that the black women who were rated most attractive that they earned more than white women? How do you explain that?
Yeah, yeah. So in the paper, one of the technical terms that I use a lot in my research is this idea of bodily capital. And this idea is basically that when we think about the forms of capital that people have, they have like their education. So that would be, like a culture, connections, their social capital. But we also have our physical bodies, how we look, and our skin tone, our faces, our hair. Our bodies are really important in the social world. How we're perceived shape how people treat us and how we think of ourselves. So this is a form of capital too. And skin tone, looks, these are forms of bodily capital then. And one of the things about capital is when we think about the value of any form of capital, it's really about scarcity. That's what really gives you the value. So as someone who graduated from Harvard like yourself, you have a scarce credential, right? You have something that has a lot of value. Well, if you're an African-American woman whose physical features are highly atypical, really light skin, light hair, light eyes, all these sorts of things, there's a premium for that on the labor market given the scarcity. of that particular phenotype as being a Black woman. And we can see that in Hollywood. We can see that among singers and all kinds of things. So in a sense, I wasn't totally surprised to find this kind of outlier effect among Black women.
And I guess as you're saying that, one, fascinating, just fascinating information. I'm thinking of women like Mariah Carey,
Yep.
right? I guess she would fit that definition of someone who would rate high on the lookism scale because she's light skinned, she has light hair, it's long, she has a beautiful body. Obviously, thinking of Halle Berry, thinking of Beyonce. I mean, there's not a long list, but clearly a list of Black women who would fit, I would imagine, would rate high on this lookism scale. Wow. Okay. And those women you're saying are going to earn 63% more than the women who rate low on the attractive scale.
So the way it works is that the Black women who are rated on the lower end of the scale, they earn 63 cents to a dollar compared to those women at the highest end.
Okay, 63 cents to a dollar. Okay.
And that gap is actually larger than the Black-white race gap. So if we think about just comparing, say, Black men to white men, net of their education, that gap in earnings is actually smaller than this lookism gap among Black women.
Wow.
It's that big of a gap.
When we think about this in-group discrimination that you described, oftentimes you'll hear activists in particular say that Black folks have been trained to look at each other through white supremacy lens, right? A white supremacist lens. Would you agree that the reason that Black folks are judging each other by these standards that have been used by Europeans to judge Blacks is that because we've been inculcated with that, that same philosophy about light is bright or bright is right? Are we suffering from that?
I think we are, absolutely. And I don't like to point fingers and say it's our fault for suffering from that. We live in a society that has a certain social and racial hierarchy, and we understand the categories that everyone are using. We understand the concepts that people are using, and we can use them just like everyone else uses them, regardless of race. One thing I like to highlight, though, when we think about this idea that we've been inculcated, the reason why I take on a study looking at lookism and earnings, there's actually incentives to perpetuate this too. So it's not just about this psychological quirk, it's that the social hierarchy sets up incentives, material and symbolic incentives to keep this whole thing going. And I think that's
Give us an example
another important thing.
Give us an example of the incentives.
So incentives would be like how much money people are earning. Like you said, even in your opening, people are spending money on things like creams and all kinds of things to process their hair and all these sorts of things. There's incentives to do that because you're treated better in your everyday life. You might earn more money. You might be treated better even among your own friends and family. There's certain standards of appearance that become entrenched in the society, and those are deeply rooted in the kind of colonial experience, slavery, and all these sorts of things. So those are the incentives. You're treated better, social status, you make more money, all of these sorts of things. And when we think about social stress and mental health, those things matter a great deal. People who are treated poorly in their daily lives, that's what discrimination is, they tend to have worse mental and physical health because that's a very stressful situation to be treated as you're less than every day. So it's not just a psychological thing, there's incentives here.
You said the in your article, you said in-group colorism is more dangerous and has a greater negative impact on your health than even everyday discrimination. Explain that.
So, the idea here is simply that if we think about the different forms of discrimination that exist, and we're just talking about interpersonal discrimination here. I want to, separate that out from things like segregation and structural forms of discrimination that take place over, centuries and decades. But interpersonally speaking, if you are the target of discrimination from like your own friends or your own family members, that can be more damaging than being discriminated against by, an out-group member, say a white person in public, because in a sense, you've been socialized more. On average, Black people have been socialized more how to handle that kind of a situation, as opposed to being discriminated against because you're darker skinned in your little friend group or among your family members. How do you deal with that? Who do you talk to? Were you socialized to deal with that? So it can be more damaging because it catches you with your guard down, so to speak.
So, okay, you weighed a lot on us this morning, Dr. Buck. Help us now move to how do we change this? This is like bizarre, right? This is no scientific reason, I would imagine, why a light skinned person should earn more money than a dark skinned person or have more opportunities to marry or get a lesser prison sentence. All of these disparities that exist, there's no basis for it. There's no logical basis. There's no scientific basis. It's just like you said, based on how these social,
The
situations have been set
hierarchies.
up,
Mhm.
hierarchies have been established. So how do we start to break those hierarchies and start to change people's minds about how they view people in a way that's fair and equitable?
Sure. So I would say two things. One, one thing that we're dealing with is the historical legacy of these advantages over time. So to the extent that people in previous generations were treated better because they were lighter skinned, they've got a cumulative advantage over a number of generations, right? They've earned more wealth. They have more education, they have more stuff to pass down to their children, et cetera. And then contemporarily, in each generation, if we keep perpetuating this form of discrimination, then it makes things even worse. So you have, on the one hand, kind of the structural historical legacy of colorism. And then on the other hand, you have the contemporary perpetuation of colorism. Now, if we're going to move past these sorts of forces, people like yourself need to have more conversations about this. I think we need another Black is Beautiful moment. And I also think we need to deeply rethink how we think about race in this country. Uh, Something that I try to put in my research a lot, which is to say, I'm not arguing that it doesn't matter, we should only focus on color. But what I am saying is that if we only think about race in this really strictly dichotomous, kind of simplistic black-white way, then we're not going to ever deal with how complex this system is and construct policy and have a real deep approach to get rid of all these forms of inequality. So I think we really need to rethink how we think about race. And usually the discussions are just too simplistic. So I really appreciate you, inviting me on and having a more complex, robust conversation.
Yeah, no, this is just fascinating. And I'm sure people, as you're right, we've been trained to think about race in a very simplistic black versus white. And even the conversations we've been having over the last 18 months since the murder of George Floyd about dismantling structural racism has been, based on this simple dichotomy that you've laid out. There have been some shows like Blackish did an episode where they were dealing with this issue because the youngest daughter is a darker skinned girl in the show. We know this came up a great deal when President Obama was running for office, and this notion that somehow, he was more acceptable because he was a light skinned African American man. And, had he been a darker, skin, it would have, he would have not had the same reception from certain demographics. But are your colleagues? Yes. How do we? Thank you for coming on, having it. And I'm always that. This is where we have tough conversations. That's what this show is all about. But are your colleagues in esteemed institutions like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, Stanford, University of Chicago, UCLA, Berkeley? These institutions, are they recognizing and then having the kinds of conversations that you're talking about?
So I would say it's still, even though things have gotten a lot better for people who study colorism like myself, I do think that we're still kind of more the minority in terms of how people are thinking about race and talking about race. I mean, you talk about George Floyd and certainly race, I mean, obviously, right? But let's also talk about how, his body also played into these stereotypes as having darker skin and a more Afrocentric appearance and all these sorts of things that we know from research also trigger all these different stereotypes and these hierarchies. So we can have that more robust conversation. But a lot of the time, I feel like we have the simplistic conversation in this country, mainly because I think there's a lot of opposition to even just having the simplistic conversation. So imagine the more complicated one.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here wondering, as we're trying to dismantle structural and systemic racism, do you think talking about it in the way that we are, these nuances that happen, this, in group discrimination, maybe people think that that would somehow, undermine or detract from the larger narrative because, in many ways, the structural racism is, I don't want to say it's more important because, as you just said, the physical and mental health of individuals is at stake. from this in-group discrimination. But do you think we're sophisticated enough in this country to have both conversations? Because, as you said, it's already difficult enough to talk about dismantling structural racism.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I would just say this. When we think about colorism, it's not just the in group, right? I highlight the in group in terms of mental and physical health, but a lot of the time when we think about this historically, it was the picking and choosing done by whites among African Americans along this kind of color continuum that really was the foundation of the in group discrimination that we see today. They set the hierarchy, not African Americans. So I like to highlight that. And then in terms of thinking about the structural aspect of racism, I think we get into a trap sometimes in the simplistic conversation when we come at this with a very blunt and simplistic approach that doesn't highlight the nuances, because it gives weapons to people who are on the other end to kind of dismiss a story that's too simple. I think it's okay for us to have a more complex conversation that's much harder for people to actually dismiss. So really quickly, in one of my studies, I look at skin tone and incarceration and arrest among African Americans. And one thing that's said a lot in that literature is that it's not really race, it's class. If you want to understand why someone's getting incarcerated, arrested, it's because they have less education, they're not in the labor market. But one of the findings in this study that I conducted was that even after you took education and earnings into account, you had darker skinned Black men in particular having way higher rates of arrest and incarceration than lighter skinned Black men. This is not comparing Black and white people. This is comparing among Black people and finding a colorism effect even after we take education into account. So then what's your explanation, right? People who are on the other end and saying it's just class. I control for class and I still find this color effect, right? So this is a stronger signal of bias in the criminal justice system than just comparing Black and white people who have vastly different social backgrounds, perhaps. What could explain why a darker skinned Black man who has just as much education as a lighter skinned Black man is having such a tough time in the criminal justice system, right? And I think that's where this more sophisticated conversation actually has advantages, because it makes it harder for people to kind of dismiss us by saying race versus class and dismiss this kind of more simplistic approach.
For white people who may be in denial about the fact that they do discriminate against blacks based on the color of their skin, or find darker skinned Black people more menacing, more potentially violent than they do when they see a lighter skinned Black person like a Barack Obama or someone. What do you say to them? How do you help them start to even get in touch with that? Because that's that's like one of those things where people, you could see, they get very defensive about and would be very argumentative to the point of denial about that being their reality. But we do know, and there have been studies that show, when darker skinned people get on an elevator, what the response is when they walk into a retail store. So there are all of these examples of white people fearing darker skinned Black people in a way that they don't lighter skinned people. But just on a personal level, I mean, we talk about dismantling structural racism, but just anybody that's white that wants to, get in touch with their feelings about this, how can they start to themselves just understand that and then move past it?
Well, it's really, again, I would say it's really tough. I mean, lots of social psychological research shows that it's really hard to get over these biases, especially skin tone biases. Those are very persistent biases. I would say, again, it comes down to getting educated about these things and really being honest with yourself. And I would include African Americans, Latinx, Hispanics, Asians. I would include all of us in that broader conversation around colorism. And there's something really powerful in what you just said there, though, because another reason why I think this more sophisticated conversation is important is because a lot of the time what we can see in the media is that whites are able to play the exception game. And by that, what I mean is they'll say, I don't have a problem with Black people, my friend, this other person, I liked Obama, blah, blah, blah. But if it's just the exception, maybe the one that's more palatable, the lighter skinned one, the one that, dresses the right way, sounds the right way, you're still perpetuating these biases, right? So the deeper conversation is not about the exception, but about the group as a whole, and having a conversation directly about when the melanin matters, when the facial features matter, and to have that kind of a conversation so that they can't wiggle out of it by pointing to, someone who is the exception, so to speak.
Wow, we've got to leave it there, Professor Monk. Such interesting and revealing information from your studies and your work. Really got to have you back. I want to continue this conversation. This is such a interesting topic that I think definitely not talked about nearly enough, but needs to be included in this national conversation as well as these kind of individual conversations. You know, lots of folks have been asking, how do they become an anti-racist? And
Right.
clearly you can't even answer that question without talking about, you know, these skin tone biases, lookism, which is my new word for the day, and I'm going to be talking to everyone about lookism now, because we need to be talking about these things. But definitely want to have you back to continue this conversation. Thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for representing in such a great way. You know, representation matters. We lost your little Harvard sign at the top, but
Yeah.
well, glad to see Harvard has someone like you on their staff and teaching the kind of courses that you're teaching and showing the kids, both black, white, brown, Asian, whatever, that someone that looks like you can be a professor at Harvard talking about these very complex issues. Not sure
Thank you.
that exists in all universities like Harvard, but glad to see Harvard leading on this.
Well,
Take
thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thanks
My
for having this
next
conversation.
guest is Cindy Smith. She is the Vice President, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with the National Research Group. Now, first of all, welcome back, Cindy. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you for having me again, Areva, and good morning.
Your organization, Cindy, lots of research on the intersection of entertainment and technology. And of course, the issue of race comes up frequently. And I know you've been involved in some weekly focus groups as well as a major study with the Oprah Winfrey Network. And as a result of that study and these weekly focus groups that you are participating in, this issue of colorism keeps coming up. So I want to talk with you this morning about, what are folks in these focus groups, what are they saying to you about this topic of colorism?
Well, Areva, when we are doing these studies about representation in general, we want to find out what is it that's going to move the needle in terms of purchasing decisions and viewing behavior. And what constantly comes up unaided is the issue of colorism. Most people agree that we have made great strides in the last few years in terms of representation of people of color on screen. Black, Latinx, Asian. However, what comes up in all of these groups is the issue of colorism, in that a lot of these, advertisers or content creators tend to skew to the lighter skin actors in these ethnic groups. It comes up, as I said, with the Latinx and Black and even Asian.
Well, so the people in the focus groups, when you convene these groups, what are you trying to, get? Are you trying to get diversity in terms of age and gender and ethnicity? So give us a good sense of who might be in one of these groups.
Well, depending on our clients' requests, the age range typically goes from age 17 on up to 59 plus. And we are, trying to help our clients determine what's next in terms of content. What do people have an appetite for? And the issue of representation, or the quality and the quantity of representation, comes up quite often. And diversity goes way beyond tokenism. It goes beyond just casting the same Black actors over and over again. And as we've said, we've talked about this, Black people are not a monolith, and we come in all shapes, sizes, and colors across the spectrum.
And so when you say that the issue of colorism comes up, what are some of the, what are the things you're hearing most, other than, as you just said, that they want to see actors, actors that represent a range of, diversity, not just the same actors over and over again. And there is this belief, you said, that, darker skinned actors don't get as many parts, aren't portrayed in as many stories. Do you have any research to bear that out, that light-skinned actors are actually doing better in Hollywood than darker skin?
Well, we don't have any research that's saying that lighter skinned actors are doing better. We do know that they're getting more roles, and we can see that. And when one of the questions that we ask in terms of representation, we're like, what do you want to see? And people say, oh, I want to see people that look like me. okay, let's break that down. What does that mean? And that's when colorism comes up. They're saying, when I turn on the TV, I tend to see the lighter skinned actors getting all the roles. It's very few roles for, brown skinned, dark skinned actors. And that's where they would like to see the diversity. So again, it's not just the quantity of representation, it's the quality. And just seeing the variety of skin tones. I look at my family. I'm one of three girls, and the three of us are all very different shades. One sister is very, very light. I'm kind of in the middle, and the other is on the darker end of the spectrum. So I know for a fact, I live this, that we come in all different shades. And that's what people want to see represented on screen.
And does this apply also, Cindy, when you're asking about commercials? Because some of the actors, people may think this is, relegated to TV shows or films. What about commercials?
When we did the study with the Oprah Winfrey Network, we really focused in on brands and advertisers and what people were looking for and what would prompt them to make a purchase. And the thing that came up time and time again is, I want to see people with my skin color, with my hair texture, and we're not all light skinned with straight hair or light skin with, curly ringlets. We have natural hair, we have dark skin, and that seeing a product that represents someone that looks like me is going to prompt someone to go ahead and purchase that product.
And have you noticed over time, have these attitudes changed? Is it this moment where you think we're having these conversations about equity and inclusion and dismantling racism? So do you think people are talking about the issue of colorism now more and this representation more in this moment? Or have you seen this be pretty consistent over the last, say, decade or so?
Well, in terms of what as a Black woman, it's been consistent in wanting to see a variety. My friends and I talk about it, and I have friends in all shades. But what the difference is that the content creators are now asking the question, and they want to take action to make a change. Because I've heard it time and time again, but for a research team to say, hey, we need more Black people, they need numbers to back it up. So that's where the National Research Group comes in, and they ask us to convene these studies on their behalf and really not just have people fill out a survey, but speak to them and really get into the heart of what it is that they're looking for.
So just to be clear, it sounds like what you're saying is, for actors or people of color to say they want to see more people of color in television, films, commercials, the buyers, the decision makers are saying, well, show us the numbers that support that if we put more Black people of different skin tones in these commercials or in these movies or in these TV shows, it's going to, inure to our bottom line. It's going to drop to the bottom line. We're going to see more revenue. We're going to see, our companies get bigger, our revenue base get bigger. Is that, where you guys come in, is to try to document that this does have some impact on revenues?
Absolutely. And that's why, we've done this work. We've commissioned work on our own. The thought leadership piece that we put out called Representation Matters was fully funded by National Research Group. And then from that, we've done individual studies for our clients, because again, they're spending millions of dollars on these productions and they need the numbers to back it up. And we've been able to show them the numbers time and time again. And that is the beauty of this research. It has been very consistent. No matter how we ask the question, this is what comes up.
So is the opposite, should the opposite hold true, Cindy, that if we don't see Black faces on commercials or in film or in TV, is that because the research doesn't support that, they're going to be successful, that there's going to be success? Because we still see a lot of commercials that are predominantly white. We rarely see whole Black families in commercials. So is that because the research isn't there to say if you have a whole Black family, that people are going to go out and buy your product?
No, because that was one of the other things that definitely came up in the research. In fact, one of the studies that we did, 85% of the respondents said that they want to see loving families and good family relationships. And that has not always been the case. They also want to see a whole Black family in commercials. Oftentimes you might see a mixed race couple in a lot of advertising. There has definitely been a trend towards that. But we have research that proves seeing a loving Black family intact or a loving Hispanic family intact, people will respond to that. And they'll respond with their eyes on the screens, butts in seats, and credit cards on the table.
So then that begs the question, Cindy, as to if your research bears out that people say, 85% want to see more intact, loving Black families, why aren't we seeing more of them? Because, we can maybe count on one hand the number of commercials that we may see in a given day or a given period, but it's not as if we were seeing a barrage of whole Black families, advertising everything from toothpaste to, dishwashing detergent, cars. When you think of all the number of commercials that we see throughout the day.
Yes, well, I'm hoping that because consumers have been very, very vocal about what they want, I'm hoping that not only hearing it from the consumers, having it backed up time and time again by the numbers, that we will see a change in the advertising industry. Because there has been some change, but there's definitely a ways to go.
So is it the case that the advertisers, the studios haven't all gotten caught up on this research, and that you guys are in the process of disseminating these numbers, and hopefully this change will start to take place?
Absolutely. One of our clients had actually commissioned representation research prior to the George Floyd murder and all of the protests, and I applaud them for that. And we are now on the second phase of following up to see how much the needle has moved, perceptions have changed over the last 18 to 24 months. So this research is ongoing, and we're going to continue to do our part at the National Research Group to help get the word out that diversity sells.
How many organizations, Cindy, I know you guys are just one of many companies that may do this kind of research, but how widespread is it that, advertisers and studios and, Hollywood producers are commissioning this kind of representation study? I mean, is this now a thing where everybody wants to know what, diverse people are thinking, what Black and brown people are thinking, and what is driving, them to make purchases?
Well, I have certainly seen a surge within our company, and yes, there are other companies that do it. Because I'm on a number of email lists, I get, invited to webinars to view what research they've done more in the consumer purchase space. In terms of viewing, I feel like National Research is definitely the leader in this type of research in terms of content creation. But I am pleased that others are getting on board and making an effort to make this a part of their offerings, not some special report. And we do have clients that have done minimal research in the past, but this is the most that I've seen in quite some time. And I'm pleased to see that they are looking to make a real change. And we'll be able to give the numbers to back it up.
Yeah, that's exciting. And this surge, you haven't seen any drop off in it? I mean, because we've had conversations about backlash and regression, but in your industry, in terms of entertainment and technology firms wanting to know about the correlation between representation and dollars spent, that surge is still continuing.
Oh, absolutely. And some of the RFPs that when we're bidding on a project, especially the tech companies, they want to know what is the diversity like within our own organization when they're considering who they're going to award the work. Because as we've talked about before, you have to have people of color behind the scenes creating the projects for the authenticity to show on the screen. And I would say CBS, I will applaud them. They have a casting initiative with I think they started with their reality shows, but also with their non-scripted shows. They have to have, I think it's 40% of the cast must be people of color. They're changing their writing room where they have actual percentages that they need to have behind the scenes working on these shows. So I am seeing a real change for the better.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Cindy. Always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. Excited to hear that this surge is still continuing, because there's some news coming out to suggest that the period where Black was in is waning, and we're seeing some regression. But I'm glad to see that these technology firms and entertainment companies are still interested in knowing what many of us have always known, but they're getting the data to back it up, which is that more representation does matter. And it not just matters, but it definitely impacts the bottom line.
Absolutely. And thank you again, Areva, for just shedding the light on this very important topic.
Great. Let's talk soon, my friend. Deep dive on the beauty industry and the entertainment industry. We've heard some comments by my first two guests about the entertainment industry, but joining me next is Reggie Ponder. He is a film critic for WBEW in Chicago. He's a frequent contributor to Variety magazine, amongst others, and he's a returning guest to the Special Report. Also joining him is Amira Adawe. She is founder and executive director of Beauty Well, a project aimed at ending skin lightening practices and chemical exposure. Good morning, Reggie, and good morning, Amira. Having this really interesting and deep conversation about colorism started with Professor Ellis Monk at Harvard University, who told us that we are thinking about race too simplistically in this country, and we're talking about it too simplistically, only focused on Black versus white, that we really have to talk about the skin color discrimination that happens both in group, as he described it, as well as out group. And no better place do we see that on display, or I shouldn't say better, but no place do we see that on display more than in Hollywood. Reggie, I'll start with you. This new movie, Passing, is all about that, right? A Black woman passing as white, marrying a white wealthy husband, and reaping the benefits, so she thought, of her whiteness. Help us understand how Passing is in many ways not such an unusual movie for Hollywood.
Yeah, well, they do two things here. They show two light-skinned African American, and they show one with their foot in the African American life, and then one with their foot in the white life, and the trials for both of them. Both of them have some issues, so it's really great that Professor Monk talked about the intra and the outra, because it is true, and I think that this raises a lot of questions that people might be saying today. Are we really still talking about people trying to pass? Why is that important today? And I think that you framed this discussion really well. And Areva, if I may, I want to say that I love what the professor said in terms of having a more nuanced discussion, because we do boil it down to, there ain't no Black people up in here. Why don't have no color up in here? Why? And so and then what we do is that we get mad at each other about it. But what you and the professor talked about is the foundation by which that is. We all have come up in the system, and coming up in the system has perpetuated it. And I am not as hopeful as Cindy. I am so glad that she is saying that there's some hope, some fantastic stuff coming around the corner, but we can talk about more than Passing. And I know you got other questions, so I'm gonna stop there.
I do want for you to elaborate. Why aren't you hopeful? You're right. Cindy ended by saying there's a resurgence of interest in this topic, that entertainment companies are hiring her firm to do this research, that they care about representation. But you're saying not so quick, Cindy. So why are you saying that?
Well, just look at The Harder They Fall and the discussion about Zazie Beetz playing Stagecoach Mary. Now, I think it's a little bit misplaced, because when you talk to James Samuels about it, he says nobody talks about how Idris Elba was not looking like the person that he was playing, but everybody talks about Stagecoach Mary's character not looking like that person. Nobody in his cast looked like the person. He wasn't doing a biopic, but I still understand the angst by which Black darker women have in terms of looking at those images and saying, that doesn't make sense to me. Then we look at something like In the Heights, where there's no Black Latinos at all. So when we talk about other ethnicities, we're like, okay, are you saying that there are no Black Asians, there's no Black Mexicans, there's no Black Puerto Ricans. Are you saying that? Well, if you look at Univision and they are saying that. And then when you look at West Side Story, are you saying that somebody like an Ariana DeBose could not have played the lead character? I'm happy that she played the character she did because it had more agency. It was more vibrant. She killed it. She sang, she danced, she acted, she did all the stuff she needed to do. But what would have happened if she played the lead character? Would that have been? I think what the doctor is saying in terms of there's incentives for this, that those incentives are still there. And I'm not sure as Cindy is saying, that those incentives are being broken down. Because the first thing people do when it comes to racism, this will be my last statement real quick, is they say, let's do a study. Let's set up a panel. You know, we need to study that. That's something can we convene some people?
Well, that keeps Cindy's firm working. Come on, Reggie. That keeps that research organization working, and it keeps them creating these big, nice, commission studies, right? Everybody has a study. It used to be big, thick books that would sit on the bookshelves of executives and never get read. Now they're electronic, probably still not opened in the emails. But you're right. That's a go-to default. That means I care something about this. Doesn't mean I'm gonna do anything about it, right? But it means I'm going to convene a national organization. We're going to do some focus groups. We're going to talk to some people. But we're not going to bash Cindy's organization because she's not here to.
Oh, no. I love Cindy. And I'm glad. I'm with you. Is that I'm glad that they're doing it. I'm just saying that history has shown that we will do the study, but we won't do the work.
Yeah.
We won't do the next step behind that to say, okay, how can we actually make some changes? What the professor said was that he also said it's not that easy to talk about trying to shift that iceberg that we're talking about, because it's not the intra is because of the outro. So
he was very clear that we're so entrenched in these notions about light skin versus dark skin that it is very difficult to start to get people to think differently. Amir, I'll bring you into the conversation. You do a lot of work around this in the beauty industry and these beauty standards that say that, people have bought into light being so much better that they're willing to go to these dangerous measures, including bleaching their skins and using injectables and all of these other chemical processes, hoping to lighten themselves. And again, many of us may say, yeah, that used to happen back in the 50s or 40s or something, but they're kind of surprised to learn that it's still happening today.
Yeah, very true. First of all, thanks for having me. This is really great discussion. And I agree with you, because when 11 years ago, when I started doing this research and campaigning against skin lighting and chemical exposures, even government systems, individuals were telling me, well, this doesn't impact every community. This may be impacting only the Black communities, and knowing that it's not only isolated to Black communities, it's the Latinx, the Asian. Skin lighting practice is a huge global issue. And so I had some communications with some older folks and that said, this used to happen many years ago. We still have this problem, but yet some of the people were still using some of these skin lighting moisturizers that become part of the culture, and that people get used to using because their family members used to use, but they didn't know that these contain toxic chemicals and that it's actually bleaching their skin color. The other thing with the United States is that, yes, you have, like the African American communities, but there are also Black immigrant communities and Asian immigrants and Latinx communities, immigrants who actually came from countries that experienced colonizations. And colorism becomes so much embedded in their cultures. And so they come to the United States having to have their culture, and that part of skin lighting is that part of the culture where people use skin lighting products to fit in, like the professor said, to fit in, to get acceptance, but also it associates with their economic well-being, their countries of origin. And then when they migrate to the United States, that is still the case that they experience, colorism, bullying in schools, in workplaces, and all of that. And so skin lighting is something that they think that will help to change their skin color, but in return, they are getting exposed to multiple toxic chemicals like mercury, hydroquinone, and highly potent steroid, which is impacting their health outcomes.
Yeah, people willing to risk their health because they think they can improve their social status if they are lighter skin. And Reggie, we talked about this the last time we were on the show, an attack that I received, being accused of bleaching my skin, which is, just ridiculous. I've never used a bleaching cream in my life. But there is this sense that there are Black people who do bleach their skins, who do try to change their appearances. And one thing that Cindy said, she said they hadn't done explicit research, Reggie, but she said that there is this notion that in Hollywood, lighter skinned actresses and actors get more parts than darker skinned folks. So there may be people sitting at home saying, but what about Viola Davis? What about Samuel L. Jackson? What about Denzel? What about Idris? What about these darker skinned actors that are at the top of their game, A-list celebrities, not just A-list Black celebrities, but A-list in all of Hollywood? What do we say about, are they just exceptions to the rule?
This is why you should have Professor Monk on every week, right? Because he's talking about a nuanced discussion. When we look at this just on the surface, we were like, yeah, what about Viola Davis, Samuel L. Jackson, and we can go on, Idris Elba, and go on and on with these people. Firstly, the men, darker skinned men, have a better time in Hollywood than darker skinned women.
Really?
Well, think about it. We could just Morgan Freeman. We can keep
Sidney Poitier.
Sidney Poitier. We can just keep on naming them, and we'd be here forever. So darker skinned men have a better time in roles, and in fact, our top actors are darker skinned. Now, but women are the problem. Is that my daughter says the term white adjacent. So you trying to get new words. So white adjacent.
I got lookism and white adjacent. Okay, come on, bring it. What's white adjacent?
And white adjacent is that if a Black person, the closer a Black person is to white, the better they do in terms of women in Hollywood. I don't mean in better they do in terms of money and all that type of stuff. I'm talking about in terms of roles and exposure. When you look at Viola Davis, does she get roles where she's in love? When you look at the darker skinned women, do you see them in these real robust relationships? But no, you look at what they're getting their awards for from an Oscar perspective, is things like The Help and stuff like that. Lupita Nyong'o in 12 Years a Slave. So where is the Issa Rae's of the world? Where do you see that fullness of the life and the love and the relationship? You don't see it as much really quickly. So we look at the Euphoria, you got Zendaya. You look at Blackish, you look at The Hate You Give, Amanda Steinberg. You got Gossip Girls with the two lead are light-skinned women. This is not their fault, but it can be part of their fight. It's not their fault, but it can be part of their fight. I'm so tired of us putting it all on them, because it's partially on them, but it's also on all of us to try to figure that out. But then when you look at Raising Dion, the mother on Raising Dion, when they first put it out, was a dark-skinned mother. But when they actually ended up doing the project, was a light-skinned mother. So women in Hollywood, dark-skinned women in Hollywood, have a tough time either getting roles and having agency in those roles.
Let me ask you, when you say white adjacent, you're saying that they do better when they play roles where they are adjacent to a white star? Is that what you mean?
No, that their skin is closer, their skin color is closer to white.
Okay, so they're not passing, but they just are closer.
No, their skin color is closer to white, and we talked, and the professor even talked about that. And as you see that, you and I talked about this last week or a couple of weeks ago about even commercials. When you look at these commercials, you have mixed race. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. But why is it always mixed race? Mixed kids, biracial kids. Why is it always that, as opposed to what Cindy was saying, people really want to see?
Right.
Now, you think this is a new phenomenon that people really want to see this now? No, people have been wanting to see it
No, which is why
forever.
I asked her, like, what, is this just a moment? And again, from George Floyd, there's been more interest in these kinds of conversations, and people are commissioning more studies as a way to address these issues. Amara, let me ask you this lookism. So Dr. Monk talked about beyond skin color, there are these subjective factors that say if you look a certain way, that if you rate higher on this attractive scale, you're going to earn more, you're going to have more benefits in our society. Is that what you find in the research that you're doing? I mean, your focus is on beauty, so I would imagine women are trying to not just be lighter in skin color, but they're trying to quote unquote be more attractive, be more beautiful.
Absolutely, and that's absolutely most of the things that I'm finding from people over the years. My research have focused on communities in the U.S., but also globally. And yes, the association is if you're lighter skin or closer to lighter skin shade, your likelihood of finding husband is higher. Even boyfriend, the lighter you are in some cultures, your economic well-being, the fact that you can find jobs or even retain some jobs or even get interviewed. Once you come to the interview, if you're darker skin, that's hard for whoever is interviewing. But also in some countries, in Latin America, the communities that I've interviewed that live in the United States talked about in their original countries, their political power also depends on their skin color, meaning that you can become a politician or run for an office if you're a lighter skin Latinx. And so it deeply associates with a lot of things that these wants to get into, and also most importantly, social acceptance. Dr. Monkey talked about within group discriminations, and that is very harmful, as he indicated. But also, I want to indicate that those who are doing that harmful practices, they actually don't know historically where it's coming from. So that is why we are in position to educate them. Countries that have experienced colonizations, they left a legacy. Yes, the colonizers left, but they left a legacy that becomes so much embedded in cultures. And so these people, they don't know, some of them, where it's coming from. So that's why we need to teach their identity, their true identities actually, and history. And so that is why it's so important to change the narrative. And that is the work that we do. How do we actually redefine beauty standards? And in order for us to redefine beauty standards to address and create more representations, we have to do all of these grassroots research on colorism and why even people practice skin lighting to begin with. And so it's so important. And also, Areva, it gets to the media as well. Like if you like those Black role models, if they come up to the media and their skin is showing lighter skin than their actual skin color, that also sends a wrong message to a young Black person who is growing up. And so I think the reason why that we need to create more representation is to create more role models. And then the other thing, I just want to get to what Cindy was saying in terms of the question that you asked. Are you seeing more of these researchers now after George Floyd's death? And I think, I've been doing this work more than 11 years. And within the last 2 years, I am seeing more narrative around colorism and more people talking about it. And so I think that's taking us to the right direction of raising more awareness and eventually combating these harmful practices.
Well, I'm glad you're confirming what Cindy is saying, is that at least there's an interest in. I'll give you the last comment, Reggie, and I want to go back to the movie Passing. This is a spoiler alert, I should say. At the end of the movie, there's this interesting twist. So the woman that has been passing all of her life, who marries the wealthy white guy, inserts herself into her Black friend's life, into her Harlem lifestyle, loves the Blackness of her Black friend, And it really kind of shows that the coveted prize is not whiteness, but it's acceptance and it's the beauty in blackness. I thought that was a really interesting twist where you had someone really aspiring to be accepted as black, even though they had been passing as white. Do you think we need more films like that that show that, you know, whiteness isn't always the prize that you think it is, that there is beauty in blackness?
I think we need more films in general that celebrate the diversity within a diversity. I love, again, what Professor Monk talks about in terms of a more nuanced discussion. So yes, that would be great to have movies about how people see Black life as wonderful, as vibrant, as all of the things that come along with where people kind of pine for being in the white skin, so to speak. You know, there has been studies that have said where they've asked white folks, would you switch places with a Black person? And I think overwhelmingly most white people have said no. I just want to leave you with this, Areva, is that people who are attacking this problem, I would just want to say, do this. Attack the practice, not the person. Talk about the impact, not the intention, and build coalitions, not combatants. And I think that prescription can start to help us to attack this problem in a more constructive way.
Very well said, my friend Reggie. Always a pleasure to see you. Thank you, Amira, for joining us. Thank you for the great work you're doing with Beauty Well. And again, this is a topic we're going to be talking about for a long time. So I really appreciate both of you for joining me this morning.
So much.
Thank you.
Wow, I want to thank all of my guests this morning. What an interesting conversation. I didn't exactly know where Professor Monk would take us, given the extensive research that he's done on this. But boy, did he, give us a lot to think about, introduce a lot of new concepts, and a great way to think about race and the conversations about race. So the next time we're having a conversation with our friend, our colleague, our coworker about race, let's make sure that we talk about this issue of colorism and start to have more sophisticated conversations about race beyond just kind of this black-white dichotomy. Because as the professor told us, we can't really start talking about dismantling systemic racism unless we are talking about the breadth of racism. And yes, darker skinned people experience a greater amount of discrimination, even from their own families and friends, but most definitely from the larger white society. All right, some words to live by before I get out. Dr. Martin Luther King famously said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." That speech has been played over and over again over this last week as we celebrated the life and legacy of Dr. King. One thing Dr. King didn't say in that speech, he doesn't have a dream that his little children, his 4 little children, would be judged by their light or their dark skin. Let that sink in. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Wear your mask, get your booster, and remember, we're all in this together.